Hello, welcome everyone. This is Mihai Algiu and my guest, Scott Kiloby, founder and co-developer of Kiloby Inquiries. And I guess people watching this already, hopefully what they watch the other parts. I think this is part 11. So let's go straight into it. In my work as a therapist, I would say 9 out of 10 people, even if they don't come to me for that, they come for some diverse type of suffering. Almost all of them, they have some degree of trauma. That by doing this kind of awareness-based somatic inquiry, awareness-based somatic processing, and it comes up, it's on the table. Lately, since I've experienced your modality on my own skin, and I was studying before I met you for a few years, I found from my own experience that it was more surgical, more effective for my purposes. So I decided to, okay, I need to incorporate this because it helps me work with trauma, with deficiency story, with this or that. Now, lately, I'm using it much more. I'm like, so there's element of overlap with Hakomi, which is awareness-based somatic psychotherapy. There's some overlap, very similar principles, and the mining and the unpacking the file, thought, feeling, sensation, memory, thoroughly. I'm using much more this modality I learned with you for trauma. Small traumas, big traumas, and it works. So, yeah, I wanted if we can have this talk on trauma, more like having maybe our viewers have a deeper understanding of what do we mean by trauma. I mean, there can be different types of trauma. There may be in society some idea about trauma, but there might be more, let's say, more complex understanding. Also, what's the impact afterwards? And also, I want to say that we may go also experientially how to, what would be some way to go at it in a safe way. And as a warning and caveat, so yeah, if you're watching this and you're not familiar and you don't have a therapist, so don't do this at home. Try to unpack your own trauma by yourself in your bedroom, because these tools are somehow very sharp. They are very sharp, and it's good that they are sharp because they get to the past quickly. But you may cut yourself by yourself, so don't do this at home by yourself. And I want to ask you, Scott, yeah, I know that that was not what you initially created it for. And yeah, how did it go about? As you are working with people coming from spiritual satsangs, being stuck or whatever, how did it get to trauma?
If you rewind a few years back, if I just remember, like, what was 2007 like, or 2010, we didn't talk about trauma. We weren't really as trauma informed as we are now as a culture. So I kind of joke sometimes, like, well, we used to just call that triggers. We have triggers, but now we know more about it. We know that there's trauma. There's a whole bunch of research and literature on there helping us, but we did not set out we're not trauma therapists or specialists. We didn't even set out, this is a spiritual path. This work has basically been there for people who are seeking awakening, enlightenment, and the embodiment of that. So how it really first came in was on my own spiritual path, that after I had these big shifts into presence, here came first, why does bullying never come up? That's what came up for me. Like, why does it almost never really come up as I'm just being in awareness? And then I started to become more curious about that. And I knew that there was something in there that needed to be explored, but I didn't know how. So a lot of the tools were developed me just trying to find my own way through my own trauma. And then somehow a kind of a methodology got created over the years. But now the methodology is just in the proper context. We're not out there just inviting everybody, hey, we're going to fix your trauma. We're saying most people that come to us are like not all of them, but many of them are people who've been like on a self-improvement or seeking enlightenment path, and they get to a place and they can't go any further. This is how they report it to me. It's like, I keep going to my teacher, I keep going to the therapist, but there's something isn't being met, and the pointers in the spiritual teaching aren't doing it, and the therapy is not reaching it. So that's where this comes in for those people, is like, how can we take you beyond that point? And what it normally is something in the body, somatic, that's really stuck. And there's a lot of unconscious programs there. So the methodology has been about reaching into those and making those unconscious programs conscious, learning to be with them from awareness. And like you say, unpacking it all so that it's not a mystery. Because I think that trauma is pretty much a mystery to people. Like, there's some of the researchers are saying that trauma doesn't arise as a memory, it arises as a reaction. That's true at first, it's a reaction, but there's a lot more there, as you know. Like, right under the reaction is quite a few programs that are driving that. So where do I want to go with that? I kind of lost my thought. But well, the point that I'm trying to make here is that we kind of just stumbled upon this, is what I'm saying. And we never set out to create a methodology for trauma. It just happens to be like a natural, organic development within a larger teaching or method that has its sights set on something bigger than just resolving trauma. We're not just, that's not what we're doing. We want to resolve it along the way, but most of the people here are looking for something deeper. I mean, the spiritual seekers especially are looking for more than that, and that's the history of it, basically.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I was a satsang goer, and I think I still am, although I haven't been lately. And I was one of those people, so I'll go to the venerable enlightened master. That is awesome. And looking back, I could see a lot of my suffering I would bring to him or her. It wasn't necessarily about how to deeper understand the nature of consciousness. It was something that I could see now is traced back to relational trauma, early attachment trauma. And yeah, the teachings were not trauma informed. And also looking back, I can see a lot of my friends, very dedicated satsang goers, non-duality, truth seekers, truth lovers. The way they talked, or some of them were shaking in the satsang, or they will have what they were saying, it was obvious to me that, dude, there is this trauma here, you know? And even now I sometimes watch and somebody says, a student says, yeah, I don't know, there's this in my chest, and it keeps having every day. And then as I see, there's fear. And then the teacher explains about this or that. And the guy says, yeah, and when I went to serve, or when I was a fireman, this happened, and it's just glossed over. And I can see, dude, there's PTSD there. Also, even when I was into Hakomi, it was interesting. There were a lot of Zen monks, Zen priests coming to study Hakomi, and they were saying that they were sitting on the cushion for hours and having peace and bliss for some time. And at some point, something weird will come up, shaking or strange things, and they realize they need to do some other type of work, you know. And because the teachings were not trauma informed, I would be left with, oh, well, I'm not able to transcend good enough. I'm not able to realize deeply that I'm not that. Yeah, I know that I'm not that, but somehow I forget. So I need to transcend more vigorously somehow, you know? And it's like, man, I need to meditate more. I need to listen more. So it's like some kind of stuck and even spiritual deficiency story, you know? Anyway, so I know these cases. At the same time, so people from non-dual spiritual stuff have it. People who come to me who are not interested in awakening have it. I have it. my colleagues, therapists, I talk to them. They talk to me about having experienced trauma. So, and also looking at my parents, my grandparents, trauma. So I think that it's pervasive. It's like somebody said once, Thomas Hubel is a spiritual teacher who actually goes into trauma a lot. That is not personal, it's a collective. It's like there's a wave, trauma wave, and the people are just bubbles into it. So it's much bigger. It's worth saying that even they did experiments with rats, that let's say some rat was burned in the fire, some generation of rats were burned in some lab fire, you know, sorry for the rats, but or something. And their offsprings, a third generation, they will be wary and carefully about heated areas or fire. So 3 generations later, the information was passed in the sperm cells, like the grandkids of the rats who died in the fire, they are avoiding anything to do with fire. So from one angle, it's a survival mechanism, you know? Yeah, so if you have any thoughts on that, or we can go more into, yeah, different type, maybe it can be different types of trauma. If you have any thoughts, we can go into that, or I can keep going with some.
Well, the first thing I want to address is why do so many spiritual teachings not include it? Or why are people going to teachers or whatever and their trauma isn't being met? And let's just talk about this because it's a big miss. It really is. And I was missing it too. Like if you look at my first 6 books, the 6th book starts to talk about trauma, but there's really nothing in there. So this was not a trauma-informed teaching. But I went and opened addiction treatment centers, and you cannot avoid the issue of trauma when you're treating addiction. So that's how we became more trauma-informed. But if a teacher's out there and just sticks to their tradition, we've said this before, like passing down the knowledge, the skills, the practices from the tradition, and if nothing from the outside is allowed in, that's how these traditions work sometimes. It's like, this is all the knowledge and experience and everything is within my tradition. So I'm only going to look at the tradition. And if there's no place in the tradition for this trauma, it's not going to be met. And so that's I think part of the reason, because people ask about this a lot. Like if we're talking about non-duality and spirituality or awakening enlightenment, how could that possibly not include or just resolve all of your trauma when you wake up? And we've already said how it doesn't. We've talked about that, but maybe understanding that historical context here, like we didn't even know about trauma really well until 10, 20, 30 years ago. It started to be really in the last 10 years. Yeah. So anything that's been operating blindly to what's been developing and the knowledge that we're getting will of course leave you feeling short. It just won't meet you. So that's one explanation for that. But yeah, like you say, there's more than just spiritual seekers interested in trauma work. I mean, that's true. It's not just spiritual seekers. So you asked about the different kinds of trauma. I mean, we can use the big words: developmental trauma, complex PTSD, shock trauma. There's all kinds of words. But what I like to say is, like, anything that happened that left an imprint because the emotions couldn't be processed, like anything. It could be a relationship, it could be an event that was scary or painful, and it just left an imprint. You know, the researchers will get very like detailed about exactly what's happening in the nervous system, and you can go learn about that. But for me, trauma is an inside job mostly. So the knowledge that I have about trauma really didn't come from the books. It came from exploring and seeing, okay, so what's really going on in my experience? And for all of the different traumas, whether it's relationship trauma or event trauma or whatever, we still at least share one thing in common, which is big, is that each of us experience it through words, pictures, feelings, and sensations. And some of those are unconscious. And if you can just see it that way, it simplifies it, because it's like, well, then what is unconscious? And how can I skillfully bring that up, include that in awareness, and not be overwhelmed and move through it? And just understanding it that way: words, pictures, feelings, and sensations. And some of them are tucked away because of that painful or scary thing that happened. And now it's about bringing it back online. But like you say, not just sitting at home and just opening up a can of worms or stirring stuff up, because then you may stir it up and then you don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
But if you learn this method, and especially work with somebody in the beginning, it's like you taking, for me, it takes the mystery out of the trauma, because you can read all those books and the books are very helpful. But if you don't know your interior experience well, it's like, what is the knowledge going to do for you? You're going to be smarter around trauma, but you're still going to be suffering over it. So to become experts at our interior experience is like, not experts, but really awake to what's really going on in our interior experience, instead of just reading about trauma and filling our brain with more information about it. Yeah, that's where what I want to talk about is that experiential piece of it.
Well, I studied a lot, and then I forgot even from where, but what I retained and tested in the battlefield of the couch. It's interesting, like something shocking that created a cocktail of strong emotions, they say in the literature, like overwhelm, strong fear, strong despair, fear, something, and there was kind of too much. Somehow the system was shocked. There's some shock. And then some element that energy is unresolved. Somehow there was an impulse that needed to happen, and it didn't happen. So it's some kind of trauma freeze. And so apparently this trauma response is apparently all of these trauma responses are natural, like fighting is good to escape. Running is good to escape. Freezing sometimes is good to escape. The antelope does this every day on the savannah. Mm-hmm. And then fawning also is sometimes good to escape. But apparently with the impact of trauma is that one of them happened, and then now the system keeps being stuck there. It's some kind of unmetabolized energy in the body. That's what they used to say. Doing your work, I could see that, there's unmetabolized energy in the body that is pent up. Basically, it's repressed. And then when it comes out, it's like very seemingly scary, but there are some words into it too. There is some, it's not just pent up energy. There says, oh, I'm going to die. Oh, something. So.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and Peter Levine, one of the grandfathers of, was saying that in his book, something with the Taming the Lion. It's a classic book. A classic book on trauma is that if you see National Geographic, the antelope has been gotten, it freezes and it pretends to be dead. I mean, it doesn't pretend, it just, the nature does that. The lion gets distracted, the antelope stands up and shakes a little bit, shakes, and then runs, and then goes on grazing, having a happy life. Somehow the animals and the mammalian in the animal kingdom, they have the ability to release the intense energy or this dangerous situation. Oh yeah, and Hakomi, they were saying it's a life-threatening or perceived life-threatening. So animals in the wild, they manage to release energy, but humans, they kind of don't, Also, there was this interesting study. There were, 10 brothers or 10 siblings were kidnapped by some abuser, serial killer, whatever. And they were in a prisoner somewhere for quite some time. And then one of them managed to escape. One of the little brothers managed to escape and got help and saved everybody. Apparently 10, 15 years later, all the 9 brothers were traumatized and had severe PTSD, except the one who escaped and saved them. So it seems like just because it's in a battlefield, like the samurai. I don't know if you saw this movie, The Last Samurai. You seen it? Mm-hmm. Oh, I really recommend. It's with Tom Cruise, and he was an American soldier from 1800s with addiction and PTSD, going to Japan and meeting samurais. And basically the samurais, they would fight on the battle and they had no PTSD. Although it was very scary, but the American guy had PTSD. So my whole point here was that they can be a battlefield, and if the energy of the scary, dangerous situation is channeled into action, then it clears, and you are like, hey, it was a strong, powerful day of battle, hoorah. And some people like, oh, my partner was blew up in pieces, and I carried this in my nightmare for the rest of my life. So somehow, if the energy is somehow manages to come out, it doesn't leave such impact. For most people is, I guess, for survival, the trauma is forgotten. And many people I work with, oh, I never thought about it for 25 years. You know, it's forgotten, repressed, and that doesn't come up. At the same time, comes up sideways. You know, we talked last time, addiction, anxiety, nightmares, somatization. So if you want to riff on this or anything.
Yeah. Well, you just touched on something that's very rich, and I think we can go deeper with this because we're basing this in experience. So yes, in the moment, just like you say, something happens and the intelligence that we are reacts or responds in a certain way. But what's interesting is how that becomes our life is what I'm saying. It's so, like, for me, being bullied in 6th grade, I had to run and hide. That was my response. So then hiding was all over my life, everywhere, hiding, emotionally hiding from people physically. And, one would think, well, that's a story or a deficiency story. Yeah, it is. And it comes directly from that. And it's amazing how much one moment can change the course of someone's life or shape someone's life, because these responses that come up or that don't come up, literally they seem to grow into very extensive networks of thinking about life and relationships, and it impacts you for the rest of your life. So here's what we should say is, there are some people saying, don't go into your trauma, just regulate your system. And I think they're coming from the research that essentially says trauma is just a reaction. In other words, there's almost like there's nothing to deconstruct there. It's a reaction, regulate your system. But it's so much more than that. As you know, these things that happen grow into these networks of thoughts. This becomes our identity, our worldview, the way we see relationships, everything is influenced by and infused by these events. So I don't know how one goes through life if you're on some path of self-help, or how to avoid that, because it's such an impact in your life. So that literature I don't agree with and I don't understand, but I guess it's just trying to help people regulate, to not re-traumatize themselves and whatever else. But if you go in skillfully, you can bring up not only the initial trauma commands and responses or what happened there, like the event, but also how it's shaped your life in ways you can't even see. As you start to see these unconscious networks, you have the insight of like, oh, this is why I've been doing this all my life. Now I know, I can see it. Of course, this is the reason that I don't trust people. This is the reason. So these things are really impacting our life. So they're in spirituality. Then when you hear people say, what's the point of going into that? It's like they're missing the boat completely. So what do you mean, what's the point? This has impacted who you are, or you've taken yourself to be in so many ways. To avoid that is simply, in a way, argue in favor of more suffering. Is to say, I'm not going to go deal with that. It's like arguing in favor. I want more, bring it on. Because you have to face it at some point, or it's just going to continue to impact you in different ways.
Yeah, I get what you're going. Let's keep going there. Like, it's not just, oh, it's a shock in my system, like in your case. And I can bring different cases. Yeah, let's bring like this: being bullied in 6th grade, which means shouted at, beaten, chased, punched. So it's like physical, what I call physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, shocking, betrayal. This not to talk about betrayal, best friend, stuff like that. Okay, case number 1. I'll bring just real cases here. Yeah. Let's say a child under 4 or 5, multiply molested by the father. Yeah. Yeah. Sexual molestation by the father repeatedly. Will be sexual trauma. There might not even be clear memories there. Other case, let's say the child is taken from the mother because of various reasons, like even Gabor Mate, yeah, the example of Gabor Mate, like, you know, the child needs to go somewhere else and is taken from the bosom of the mother and is taken another family, and maybe 6 years later, the child is taken from that family to another family, yeah, and the child might not remember anything consciously, so disrupted attachment. Let's say, what else? Rape. Let's say somebody who is like in college, yeah, different. In college is going on a nice date with a recommended friend who is a good guy, and they drink, and then he becomes an animal, you know, rape, okay, another case. So in your case, we are not dealing here like just with the, you know, oh, okay, he's punching me and I'm fucking scared. And, you know, so this is some big chunk of stuff, but you are telling that was formed a deficiency story now that creates identity in like in a non-duality. Basically, your separate self, the ego that we are trying to transcend, is strongly informed by that I have to hide and I can't trust people. Yeah.
Right.
You forgot about the punching and this, and you are the good guy and spiritual teacher, but in the back of the mind is I still have to hide. I have to hide. I can't trust people, especially close one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we can get to some of the methodology, but what we're doing, as you know, is that these events or these things that happen when you start pulling up these unconscious networks, again, you start to see how your personality was informed. It's really insightful to see it, to be able to go back and unpack that, because it answers questions for people like, well, for me, it was like, why do I have to hide so much? Like before I went into it, I couldn't see it. It just felt like it was some story that I was given or something, or that something happened, but I didn't know. But have the insight of that, now that I have the insight that came from the trauma, now I can see how it applies to each one of my relationships. I can go into inquiry there because it's affecting everything. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. I don't know if there was a question. Other than I want to get to that part, is what we're really doing is making this stuff really conscious skillfully,
Yeah.
so that we can see the different networks and we can see how they connect to current relationships and everything, and then bring inquiry to those current relationships. Before this, it's like I used to say, it's like operating in the dark. It's like, okay, there's a reaction, I'm afraid. Okay, rest and feel the reaction. Okay, I rested and felt it. It's still going to come back, or it's still there. We've got to go deeper than that. We've got to go deeper into, it's not just happening in a vacuum. It's not just happening out of nothing. It's connected to your personality, your ego, your worldview, your relationship view, and what happened. It's literally informing everything.
Yeah.
And I think if people start to recognize that, they'll see there's a place for it in spirituality. How could you not, if you see that it informs your ego that much?
Yeah. If we want, you know, good non-duality, they say the aim is inner peace, freedom, contentment, desireless state. So how can I have that? And all of this is percolating in my system, or is not even percolating my system, but it drives my addiction. So it's interesting, like for you, in your case, so I know in your early days, strong addiction. So that came out of some attempt to manage, the system was trying to manage repressed pain, repressed information. And it's not just, you know, if you were to process Scott's trauma, and we go, there are different ways to go, but like say frame by frame, and the guy came and I'm hiding and he punched me and this, probably there might be all kind of stuff in your body shaking and all of that. And that energy was trapped, and you may have some release and some cathartic thing, but it's more than that. It's more than now the strategic adaptation to hide influence all aspects of your life. That too is very much connected to the trauma. So it's not just the traumatic event, but the aftermath of the traumatic event. Yeah. So let's say like this, person molested in childhood. what I noticed that it can happen two different ways. One can now later, somehow later. I don't trust men at all. I'm not even interested in men. Not interested in men. Completely shut down sexually. Completely not interested in men. And also like not like the lack of respect, lack of interest. All men are dangerous, although the person forgot about all that happened, yeah? Or also, I have to scan all the time. I have to scan all the time. I have to be careful all the time. Now, why? When we unpack the trauma, father was coming in the night. The little child was aware of the footsteps, so didn't feel like cannot sleep. So all the time very alert, yeah? Other case, same thing happened. The person becomes now super sexualized. So starts to all the time seek sexual encounters and almost seek and give herself away to strangers or for money or for this like that, coming from the same thing, yeah? Somebody raped in college. Things are pretty good, but when I would like to enjoy life and it's like, no, I can't trust myself. I can't, you know, the aftermath of that was that I can't trust myself. I used to trust myself, but I can't trust myself. I don't know why. If we go back to the original rape, comes up the, oh man, I thought he's a good guy. And oh, I can't trust myself, you know. With attachment disruption, I guess, I mean, for the child, this is like a life or death energetic experience of dysregulation that will probably show up each time there is a separation, a relationship. I have this on first-hand experience. Any breakup, anything, it comes suddenly, some intense distress, somatic, which for many years was repressed completely, so I didn't feel anything. No emotion at breakup. But as I got more older, distress, unbearable, shocking, young energy of distress. Aftermath is that I can't trust love, deficiency story. Love is going to end. Don't get too close. So you see, all of them, they have some aftermath of deficiency story. Yeah. And all of them have some kind of addiction. Some of them are into strong substances. Some are into addiction to work. Some are addicted to shopping, you know.
Yeah, and people, there's a lot of people I think who their life is just okay, you know. It's like they get into their 20s and 30s and the trauma isn't resurfacing. There's no real effects. You see a lot of people like this. And then later on in life, it starts to come up. Like, I don't know if you've seen that in your practice, where maybe PTSD symptoms or anxiety starts coming in, or in my case, chronic pain comes up. Something starts happening. And this is what I mean, like and then people reach out for help. But the thing is they're looking at these stories, these things that happen in their life without being able to connect it to the original thing.
Yeah.
When you can go to the original thing, like there have been times when, let's say a woman has an issue with men, as you say, and we spend most of the time just on the relationship with dad, the traumatizing effects of that relationship. It has an impact on all those relationships. But what you see sometimes is just like within myself. It's like, why don't I just let sleeping dogs lie? That's how it feels. It's like, if I don't see any real effects of this, why go back into it? But it's very insidious, because if you don't resolve it or bring it up, it can manifest in these weird ways. And then once it manifests, it's like trying to get out of a hole. You know, like with my chronic pain, it's like serious pain. Now I'm almost not functioning. Had I gone back earlier and been even more trauma informed, maybe I would have gone towards that, maybe not. But the way that things are set up is that there's just a lot of talk about don't just let sleeping dogs lie. Like, what's it have to do with anything? Yeah. And I think if there's nothing else that comes from this interview, if we can put that to rest, that there is a value in going back to that stuff, because it's simply running your life now. That's all. But you may not be able to see it. It's really hidden. And I just don't think until you do some really insightful somatic work that you can even see how much what happened to you is impacting almost every area of your life. So if nothing else, people listening, put to rest the idea that there's no value in looking at that, because there obviously is.
Yeah, and this sleeping dog, they are not really sleeping. I mean, really, they are not. I said the memory is forgotten, and I'm having an overall successful life. But so the sleeping dog is actually convulsing in his sleep from one angle, and then creates this tremors of our ground of being. Like there's some fundamental sense of existential unsafety, fundamental sense that I can't rest, some malaise. There's some existential malaise that people are not carefully investigating, which actually has a bunch of sensations and a bunch of anxieties and a bunch of feelings and a bunch of hidden thoughts. So they are not really, what I really don't agree with one of my teachers is saying like, hey, if the mud comes out, take care of it. But if it doesn't come out, don't go into the mud. Don't go to the mud But so this, I don't agree with that. Basically, the mud is there and is oozing these toxic gases. And that creates the so-called separate self now. I'm going to feel separate from God, separate from the world. All of this, I'm not safe. I cannot trust. I can't. There's this I in it. The feeling of I is what Ramana called the me feeling. You know, the me feeling. And the story that the mental story is the me thought. So if we want to deconstruct the me feeling and me thought, to let it dissolve in the light of aware presence, well, let's dissolve it then, right? So I like when you said it that, don't just regulate your trauma. I mean, regulate it until regulate it, because if you don't regulate your nervous system, then it's going to be much more comfortable, one cannot function. And you need to regulate as long as you are not really processing it. But ideally regulate it until you process it, and then keep regulating it and process it some more. So it kind of is discharging, you know?
Yeah, so that brings up the issue, since you mentioned spiritual teachings, is don't drudge up the mud. So it's funny that a spiritual teacher says that, because the mud is really usually a somatic issue, is what it is. Like we say the mud, it starts with like a somatic issue, and like, which means very contracted stomach or heart or sternum or something. And that plays right into not being able to abide as awareness. It plays right into it. So when the teacher says, don't judge that up, they're basically saying, don't look at that part of the ego, because that's still ego. It's just tucked away into some sensation. When you pull it up, you'll see egoic thoughts. You'll see, I'm not safe. I have to protect myself. I don't trust people, all that. How would you then transcend something that you can't see? Why would you not drudge up the mud? You're literally leaving something unconscious and an identification there.
Yeah.
So I think in a few years from now, all this will be put to rest, and we'll have even more of a sense of how trauma impacts us. And nobody will be able to get away with that anymore. But right now, we're just still becoming trauma informed. And so there's some people it's taking a while for some people to catch up with it, is what it is.
Yeah, I think even maybe we can have several talks, so we can get more zoomed out on the first part and more technical in the second part. I don't know, it makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. I can see the reason. I mean, I know the reason why they say that. They say it because, like, on the non-duality direct path, there are some of this, the direct path, starting with Atmananda, Krishna Menon, but also, Ramana and people like that. The direct path comes from, hey, don't focus on the ego to deconstruct it or this or that. Go straight for what you are. Mm-hmm. Go straight for what you are. This was the direct path as opposed to the progressive path. The progressive path start from the standpoint, I am a separate individual, and I'm working on myself to get somewhere. The direct path, they say, okay, we're going straight for the self. So basically to focus attention or interest towards the perceiver, to kind of identify the knower of the experience. And as Ramana said, I would say this, I used to use this a lot. I felt very wise and special using it. Whatever arises, be interested in that which is aware of it. So whatever arises, go back to the knower of it. So yeah, so basically they were saying, hey, if you are starting to go in the mud, some memory or some feeling, you are going away from the true nature. And the assumption there was that, hey, stay close to the true nature, and then that, yeah, the idea was that by itself is like a magical burning of the samskaras. And I think there's truth in that.
Yeah.
You know, there's some, so keep coming back to the sun and the clouds will naturally disperse. Yeah, that's the philosophy behind it somehow. Stay with the truth and the lies will dispel.
Well, let me say one thing though. Okay, so if you have a sensation here, okay, there's a sensation happening in awareness, and when you say go back to what's aware of it, when a sensation contains unconscious identifications, what you're coming back is to a story that I'm not safe, but it's unconscious, to the story that I don't trust myself. So we're not really coming back to awareness, and that's the tricky part. We're coming back to an awareness that's infused with this unconscious program. This is why I feel like we have to go deeper than that. We have to pull up and see what's in the sensation before you can jump back and transcend it. Otherwise, you're coming back. I'm just doing it from the side, but it's like this. Imagine the story, I'm unsafe is here. It's unconscious. It's connected to this sensation. Teaching says, be with the sensation, recognize your awareness. You rest back. This thing is there. This thing is there running the show, but you can't see it because the instruction is disregard.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You know, I was doing that because my teachers were saying do that, and one of them was intentionally stirring the mud because she learned from some other teacher this release of the, basically in her teaching was this idea that there's a lot of stored shit, and then that needs to be released. So she would skillfully stir it. She would stir things, memories, sensations, so which was already pretty unusual from all the other non-dual teachers. She would stir it into the field of awareness, and then she would say, hey, welcome it completely, don't focus on it, let it do its thing, and notice the aware background in which it appears. Don't focus on it, let it do its thing, notice the aware openness, and rest as that. So I was doing that, or even with her one-on-one, it will stir stuff strong, and then she will do the neti on me. Hey, okay, so you have this, it says this, and this is a voice in your head that says, I know I'm always alone, something. Is that you? Or are you that? Or are you that which is aware of it? Kept doing this, and then through this, I would be able to tune back into not the deficiency story, but the aware background. I will tune into the presence. And there was like, okay, I got it. I can see it's not real. It's a voice in my head. It's like some feeling that comes and goes. It's not real. I can see that. So at best, what was happening, that I will just have a little bit of the mud will come, a little bit, and my coming back to aware background, this will regulate my system. Actually, this is good for self-regulate. And then the rest will remain. Instead of mining out all of it, the rest will remain. So remember that I would use now this with clients. I will even more skillfully stir their stuff up, the subconscious information. And then I will do this with each one of them. Hey, you are not that. And I could see it will work in a way they will get calmer. They'll get calmer and more stable, but it will leave things unfinished very much. So after doing your work, I stopped doing that. I'm doing that just at the very end. At the very end, it's just because anyway, we need to pack it back up so you can function. I will go, okay, let's just check. There's thoughts, feelings, sensation. Are you that? Are you that which is aware of it? Okay, let's stay as what you are. I'm doing this at the end. It's almost like a ending of the surgery, stabilization. But I'm much more now going for the mud from awareness.
Yeah, it also made me think of the anger repression work that I did with that stirring things up and just being the aware presence. This was a very persistent story. So it's not like you're just going to clear things up and then you're going to be in awareness and that's never going to return again. It's a persistent and continuous conditioning. These trauma and these repressions are. So yes, not only going into the mud, but understanding how continuous and persistent it is. Because that's what I'm saying. It's the default. So that's the default. Your system defaults to that. It defaults to repression. It defaults to trauma response. So even when you're coming back to awareness, you may not even recognize you're still in the default state. You're still in anger repression, but it's calm for the moment. And that's the trick. Calmness can't be the ultimate measure of this calmness, because calmness is the opposite of stirring things up. And we might get really confused if we think calmness is the final frontier here, because then we might not stir things up that are still continuously activated here, because we keep coming to the calm state thinking I've transcended this. But because of how consistent or persistent it is, you really have it until you can bring it fully into awareness. You're going to keep repressing anger. That's what I'm saying. You're going to keep having the same trauma response until you can get, it's just too persistent to do it satsang style, is what I've learned.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not the right tool.
Yeah. It helps. It's good. I love listening to it. But it's just not enough for most people, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost would be nice to have like the whole satsang, and then there is like a little booth on the side where there's some trauma-informed kind of non-dual therapy.
Yeah.
And they are like, and the teacher is there, is like, hey, take him there. And then he's going to do some stuff, and once he's finished, he goes back and says, oh yeah, okay, that's good. I think that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. Totally. Well, because that's true, because there's a lot of people who are coming to this work who they were at the spiritual teachings and they just couldn't go beyond a certain point. Now they processed and they want to go back to some of those teachings because they can hear them differently now because of processing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're talking a lot about spiritual seekers, and there's more than that out there. You don't have to be a spiritual seeker to do this work. So maybe we can also talk about someone who's not on a path like this, who may want to benefit. I can see people coming to you for sure as a therapist, that they wouldn't have modality or light other framework. So what can we say about that, working with people like that?
Yeah, people are not seeking, well, that's, when it comes to trauma, all of those distinctions, from my experience, goes off the window, really. The resume and the ranking, the imaginary ranking. So, well, any kind of awareness-based, so not just talk therapy, that has a strong mining technology like a KI, it's a blessing, and it has to be very careful, because very quickly, in 10 minutes, one can get to some flare of burning in the chest or in the gut. That is the entry point to trauma information very quickly, So, and it's going to bring it up very quickly. And so, and what I like about the KI is that built in the mining technology is that to calm the system, because in the trauma knowledge is that you can't process trauma if the system is flooded, or if our body mind is freaking out in lay terms. So has to be, you know, what's his name, Levine with somatic sensing, that we need to titrate it. Like a cat, you put your paws in the water a little bit. Oh, it's wet. Okay, let's back up. Let's put some paws more. So little by little, rather than, oh yeah, bring it on and the bomb exploded and take it. So that they say that it goes the system beyond the window of tolerance, and you can be re-traumatized or stuck in reinforcing the aftermath. So I can see skillful trauma processing and the ability to keep the client within a manageable state. And I know in the KI, there are tools in building that. Yeah, can we talk a little bit about that to ensure safety? And so it seems
so
breaking up the sound a little bit. I don't know.
Okay, let me know if it cuts out.
Yeah.
So with these tools, because these things are sharper, as you said, there has to be some conscientiousness about that, because you can stir things up. And I think people would be surprised, for example, in a session about how we can very easily pull things up, like we can do that, but how we go through things one thing at a time in a piecemeal fashion. And there's a reason for that, so that we avoid the flooding and the overwhelm. So with a tool like this that's sharper, the point is we want to be more conscientious in how we bring things up. So we can bring things up, like someone said, it's like sipping tea. Just taking a sip here and then going to the next sip, instead of gulping it all down and overwhelming yourself. So you do have to be careful because you've got a sharp tool that can bring things up. But then if you learn the KI methodology, you'll see that we've built into it ways to keep re-traumatization from happening. We've built it in there, like if possible, looking at one thing at a time as a way. Even though you can really pull up something very powerful, you don't want 10 things that are powerful up at once necessarily.
Yeah.
You can just be with one thing, sip that tea, move on. We'll talk about that more in the next video, but this is also why we're saying don't do it at home if you don't have the skill, because you can stir up a big gulp and then you don't know what to do with it. But as you learn the KI, sips at a time, dismantling it, you're still feeling, definitely going to feel emotion, but trying to avoid overwhelm is the key. Because overwhelm turns people against the work. If you get people overwhelmed too easily, their system may just say no to any more processing because it's too scary. So it's not just about not overwhelming people, but it's also about keeping them feeling confident in the process and feeling like that they can do it. And if it's not skillful, and if you're just bringing in a sharp knife and stirring a bunch of things up, there you go. Is
yeah.
In that.
Yeah, so there's also this level of a lot of these traumas are relational, usually. I mean, it can be just there's a bomb, but most of them, it's relational. And so that's why to have the presence of someone there, actually the presence of someone there, so one is not alone with it. This is a resourcing. Yeah, in this trauma information they talk about, it's like to check the level of resourcefulness of the client. Resourcefulness meaning not that you are crafty and cunning in life or whatever, or have resources, financial resources, but that how stable is the person to handle this information. So, so the therapist or the facilitator needs to assess and track constantly the level of resourcefulness, of how stable they are, and someone able to manage their state in some way. And this cannot be done from books. I mean, I think that the facilitator needs to have done their own work. They need to have processed a bunch of their trauma to recognize that. This is not like some protocol diagram, you know? And I think just the fact that the therapist or facilitator is comfortable with that, that's a resource. The therapist being there, constantly monitoring, it's a resource. Yeah, and somehow the presence of someone there, it's a resource. And so what else came to me is that within that shock moment, there is some really yucky sensation or some pent up feelings that somehow I notice that those need to come out in some way, in a crying, in a moaning, in a shaking, in vomiting, or all at once somehow. And so that is a release. And I could see that only after that, the person can see the thought, I can't trust myself. I can see that it's not so, it's not so believable anymore. You can't just, I don't know, I noticed that you can't just deconstruct the thought as long as there's still a repression active,
Mm-hmm. So science says it says trauma often results in repression, but then how does it show up in our actual experiences? Just like that. So sometimes people are surprised, I think, to find out that what really helps to resolve something is they're finally able to get angry at mom, like full on anger coming out, or full on sadness or fear. So that's part of it. Like, because again, we should say, even though we've said it before, that it's quite natural to repress emotions if they didn't feel safe in those moments. But then those emotions are pent up as energy. So yeah, just doing neti or some mind thing that doesn't take that into account, that doesn't at least have some way of pulling up the repression, then all that energy is going to stay there. You got still a contracted body, traumatized body. You may have some clarity up here, but you haven't released the emotion that's pent up. So very much so, we want that as part of the process. Repression is coming up safely, but coming up.
Somehow working with you or applying this, I was confident before working with trauma, but I went through so much intense stuff with you in terms of processing, so I know the territory. I'm like, okay, I can see you are freaking out, but I know where it needs to go, and we can do it. I'm like, rather than being like, oh my God, what's happening now? I'm like, keep going,
Yeah. Well, and that reminds me, like, people are often looking for credentials, like, is my therapist trained in trauma? But you can't get that experience in university, as you said. So yeah, it's fine to look for credential, but wouldn't you want someone who's processed their own stuff? It's like the blind leading the blind. If not, like, I wouldn't want to be taken through a process by someone who's afraid to process their own stuff. So that is important, I think.
And you know what I notice that happens, it seems, because no matter what methodology you learn, there is some cosmic process. The processing of a trauma is a cosmic process. I guess the universe is doing it. So no matter what theories and books we read, I noticed that some of the same thing is happening. And so I noticed what's happening is that the shock, there's the shock energy, the pent up shock energy, like, oh, it's going to rape me, or, oh, I'm frozen, I'm dissociated, that there is some energy that needed to manifest that was locked. So part of the processing of the trauma is that energy now is expressed. I noticed like with people, and you can see that the body wants to do that. Let's say someone was shocking and the person was frozen, and then they start feel in their feet, energy in their feet or something. And then I'm like, okay, what do the feet want to say? Then there's trauma command, just run. So I studied this and I've seen this. You have the client, okay, can you, while you are sitting here, put your feet down and start being on the same spot. Run, get out of the house. And then it's interesting, like the person starts doing that and they'll be like, Wah! So all that energy is coming out through the running. So it's the escaping now is happening. So being trapped, it's an escaping happening later. Or something comes and says, no, you can't. I noticed, basically I verified your, so in the moment of finally that repression in the trauma is coming up, so if we zoom on that moment, where it's good to be with someone, I mean, it will be like very good. yeah, there's some pent-up feeling, pent-up energy, shaking. If there is shaking, actually it's a good sign. Any shaking, it's a good sign. And maybe some words, the trauma command, the words. So I notice all of this over and over is happening by the book, like some form of missing experience. What couldn't happen is happening now. Some release and some words. Yeah, I think you have much more experience. I'm doing this for a few years. You have many more years behind your belt.
We talk about trauma commands. We've talked about that before. Like, if you can make contact with a trauma command from something that happened, like for me, I'll just give my experience. I've shared it before.
Let's go a little bit in the trauma command because we mentioned before, but it's important. And I studied this, and they don't speak about this. It's not in psychotherapy. They don't have that. So,
yeah, well, for me, it feels more like a command than anything else. It's like in the moment, like run, get away, get off me, stop, get out, those kinds of things. I can't. And you can feel them in the body. So they run the thing. It's not just a command that happened in there. If you look at what the command is, you've lived it. If you can find the command, you probably lived the command in your life. So for me, get away was a command that was about getting away and hiding. So it ran my life. So discovering it was fascinating and helpful to finally see that my body contains did really strong commands that have been running my life. So what happens when you find that command is, this is where this work is different, I think, in that we're going to stay there. We're going to stay with that command, because this whole thing is just, okay, be with that. Now let's go to something else. It doesn't take into account how powerful that command is.
yeah.
So we'll stay on it to bring it up in awareness, to loosen the ties that bind it to the body, repetitiously. So it's one thing to discover these commands, but then what do you do when you discover it? So some people haven't discovered it yet. So the process is discovering it, but then are you just going to see it once? Are you going to then, and then let's say you see it, you see this command come up, you sit with it, and then there's the calmness. And you think, okay, I've dealt with that, but you haven't, because it's still there, is what I'm saying, running the show. So what we're doing here is, again, repetitiously bringing that back, because it's a command that's running the show. I don't know if it's really a command. That's just what it sounds like to me. I don't know about the literature, why it doesn't say that, but I think you found it too. When you discover it in your own experience, you don't need the books to confirm it, though. Yeah. That's the thing.
Yeah, it's just, makes sense. It's like some set of short words, very short sentence, which is almost like the felt experience of the body mind in the shock mode. And the body mind was, I guess for survival, it is some short interpretation. Like I've seen after working with you, I mean, myself, they will say, I have to. But I've seen with people, my experience is that, let's say with the sexual trauma in the child, but what I noticed in my experience is that in the moment of that finally bubbling up and releasing the pent up energy, there will be a repeating, like with strong feelings and even maybe vomiting or some purging in some way. It will say, you can't make me, I don't want to, no, I had this no. So that was kind of repeated as the release was happening. And then when the release was happening, there was some natural rest. And I wouldn't necessarily go back to it. Oh, you can't make me, maybe I should. I know from your experience, it was, or you're coming from the spinal tightness sensation, this would just flare. It wasn't strong feeling yet. I don't know, can we?
Yeah, so I don't know that I would have discovered this without the chronic pain, now that you mention that, because what would have been the motivation to go deep into the somatic and try to discover commands, and then let alone to stay with it if I found it, unless I was in a lot of pain. So, but you could trust the body. And so there's people who are in pain, or you're feeling tightness or contraction. Now think about this way, for those people out there, you keep going to satsang, you keep going to therapy, and the pain continues or the contraction continues, could it be for the reason that we're saying, which is that there is something there that's being overlooked constantly? Or if you do look at it, it's like, that's fine that you don't go right to it, but aren't you curious as to why the sensation remains? Like, it's much more material there. So that curiosity, if you don't have the pain guiding you, a curiosity for the truth or something, but the pain is a great helper. It's like when you're feeling contracted or tight or painful, you kind of naturally go into that to be curious, but that's just it. If you're not experiencing any real pain, I think a lot of people are experiencing like contractions that are uncomfortable, but that remain fairly dormant throughout. So you get real busy in life, and that's one way to just hide it from us, like busy, chasing this, doing that. Meanwhile, there's something in your body kind of festering around this trauma or these commands, and nothing is manifested yet. So what would be the motivator? If you're distracting yourself so much that it's not a huge deal, there may not be much motivation to go into that. But suffering is a motivator. So you have the contraction you've had that's not been comfortable for you.
Yeah.
So that's probably the reason that you become more and more curious about it. Without that there, if that was really dormant, would you even be necessarily doing that work? So there's something about suffering and pain that's a gift in the end.
Yeah, it's a necessary ingredient. Various teachings I studied, they would say, like, if suffering didn't exist, it would need to be invented. Basically, it's an ingredient on the process of healing and awakening. It's necessary. It's a...
Yeah.
As I talk to you now, I'm realizing that even as a therapist, I was a therapist associate or working as a therapist associate. I was dabbling in my own trauma unskillfully. And I don't think I'm a special case as a therapist. So I remember now, what happens with this, like they say, baby disruption attachment. The baby needs to be on the body of the mother for quite some time. That's what tribal people do. This one needs to happen. Are you there? You are frozen. Okay. So it needs to be there, and somehow the baby is taken from the mother. The baby cannot regulate themselves. So they need the nervous system of the mother to regulate themselves. If somehow the baby is taken, then the baby will feel some kind of life or death. Some is going to die. And usually that is in the area of the frontal line, where it will feel like a burning, deep burning, or like distress burning, because there have to be skin on skin, and now it's not. So what I noticed is that, first of all, those were repressed, repression, substances, and witnessing, keeping it repressed. Only through doing psychedelic assisted psychotherapy that brought it up. Like, will just bring up this sensation in me in a journey, in a psychedelic journey, not for fun, but it will bring this to but I was like, whoa, what is this? So just the emotional, energetic content will bring it. Even in the therapy, we wouldn't process it. It would just somehow coming and going and coming, going, and I'll feel, basically, I would feel the distress of the child, and then go away. But I didn't process it, the file, I remember one time I'm sitting, I break up with someone. I already have, a deep non-duality. It comes this deep feeling of distress in the frontal line. Very, can't abide. Basically, it's the strong, mysterious me feeling. And I remember that I was trying to apply the teachings. I would say, okay, welcome this completely. I want to welcome this completely. Let go, trying to change it. I will do all that. And then it was getting worse and worse. But I wasn't minding out the thoughts. And what I would do, I would say this from a non-dual teaching. I would say, there's no me in this feeling. This feeling appears in me as this presence. So I was doing that. So I will get regulated, and I will, okay, because it's true too. I mean, that statement is true. There's no me in this feeling. The feeling is in me. So I'll keep doing that, I guess, to escape it. But now I can see that I will go into it and be like, okay, if this were to say something, what would it say? Don't leave me, don't go. Crying, moaning, shaking. So I like, and actually by doing that, that will regulate my system into not a regulation on top of trauma, but regulation by discharging the trauma.
Yeah. I mean, I think we all have like various degrees of unskillfulness. You know, if you look around, that's what it is. It's just varying degrees of unskillfulness. And I had unskillfulness for sure around the anger repression, because even as I learned, I knew how to mine back then. I knew how to ask, what does this mean about me, this pain, or what it would have to say if it had a voice. But just that level of skillfulness wasn't enough for this. It had to go to the next level, which was evoking specifically a story up of repression. Like that's more than, I mean, maybe you're including mining by doing that, but when we say mining, we say questions like, what does this sensation mean about me? That's what we call mining. But I had to go, you know, one up on that, which is because as I sat there with the pain and I would say, what does this mean about me? Never did it come up to say, you can't express anger. It never came up. And yet that was the main issue, one of the main issues. So again, different degrees of skillfulness. I had to upgrade my skills. And that's how all these skills get developed, is out of necessity, out of experience. When we can only go to a certain point, is there a way to reframe it or refine the tool that gets us beyond that point? So now we've reached into the area of repression and unconscious trauma. It'll be interesting to see where it develops next, but you can see how it, if you look back at the history of this, how it just unfolds. Because again, we were varying degrees of unskillfulness, all of us, as we were moving through this. So, and then when I look at the rest of the world, I see definitely varying degrees of unskillfulness. Even some of the most skillful teachers I can see as unskillful, but that's because we all are. And then we have to, this is that my whole thing is, if you're a teacher or a therapist and you're not open, if you don't have the openness to learn something new, there you go, right there. And that's the issue, is because we're evolving our understanding of human life is what we're doing. We're evolving this. We're evolving our understanding of and our insight into consciousness. There's no room for closed when you're evolving. You have to literally be open, or nothing gets evolved to meet the next experience of repression. Yeah, that's pretty philosophical, but I feel it's true. An experiential way to, you have to be open to here's something that you may not know how to do. You have to almost like admit, I don't know what I'm doing here, and then be open.
And which it makes sense. I mean, these deep non-dual teachings, they are like, our true nature is a deep not knowing. It's so they live from unknowing and the beginner's mind, and at the same time, no, don't go there, don't do this, don't, you know. So it's like speaking from two sides of the mouth, you know.
That's interesting. I've never thought of it that way. Yeah.
But you know, both for, let's say, people wanting liberation from suffering on a spiritual path, or people, mental health clients, it's essential, basically, this presence of unprocessed trauma in the system, and I think we all have it. It does, anyway, the presence of that creates, for mental health people, not seeking enlightenment, it's just, you can't just enjoy this moment. There's always wiggliness, squirminess. This creates more thoughts, more desires to buy more shit in my house, to get more achievements. There's a constant unrest, you know. And for the non-duality people, is like you can't abide. You can't really abide as the peace that is there. So yeah, I don't see how we can't go around that if we want inner peace. I think both enlightened people and regular people, they want peace.
Yeah. And that's why I think both are welcome here, because you don't have to be on the enlightened path to do this. But the only thing comes up then, because awareness in itself is a resource. If you think of it, awareness itself is probably, for me, probably the greatest resource is when that's the foundation of your experience. But people who might be mental health clients may not have interest in that, still don't have reason, and they're not interested in it. So sometimes you have to help them a little bit to regulate because they don't have that groundedness and awareness. Whereas with the people in the spiritual path, because they've been in the awareness style teachings, they're already looking from that. It's not a new thing for them, and they can regulate from there, use that as a resource.
Yeah, that's true. So I guess the ability to witness and even the glimpse that I am the presence that has never been hurt and scratched by any trauma, that's the ultimate resource. And actually, the more a person is versed in this awareness teaching, the more you can go a little faster, the more they can handle it. I know with myself or other people, I can see that, yeah, it's intense information, but they can handle it. Also, I was working with you as a client, and I could see that, whoa, this is intense stuff. And I could see that you may want to slow it down because you may think, well, I'll be like, hey, I'm okay, keep going. Keep going. But with other people, if they don't have that, then they have to borrow it from me. Like, hey, listen to the sound of my voice. You are safe. You are surviving. Okay, so you feel your grandma. Grandma is holding your hand. I don't know. The oak tree from childhood is here. Feel this. So to stabilize them if they can't self-stabilize.
Right. That seems to be the only big difference, though, because otherwise it's all the same for all of us. Like, I like what you said, or I've said it too. Like, you can't bring your spiritual resume, the somatic processing. It doesn't matter really, because we're all looking from the same awareness that's either going to be there and recognized for you or not. But when it comes to this stuff, it's like we're put on some ways equal footing, because a sensation or a contraction is a contraction. That's what it is. Whether it's in the body of an enlightened person or not, it doesn't matter. Pain, chronic pain is pain, it hurts like hell. Ego. We all meet in this place where we're having the same experience in that way. The structure of our suffering is the same for all of us. The content is different, but the structure is the same.
Yeah.
There's awareness, there's words, pictures, feelings, it's insane. Some of it's unconscious.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's true for people who don't follow awareness teachings. They still have words, pictures, feelings, that's unconscious.
Yeah, it seems like you can't transcend trauma. You have to go through it. And I had this, David Hawkins had this powerful statement. He would say, walk through it. The way out is through. Walk through it no matter what. Walk through it skillfully with help, but we can't transcend it. We have to, even in that movie, Dune, I don't know if you saw Dune. Anyway, this whole statement that, put a hand there in the box with pain, and then, fear is an illusion. Let it kind of walk through it. Let it take, you need to go through the fire to be on the other side somehow, but skillfully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty much the message we've been sharing all along, isn't it? That the only way out is through. But the people that are not going through it maybe shouldn't be going through it if you don't have the skill. That's the other piece of it. Yes. Like you said, that it takes skill. This is like painful stuff, scary stuff. I mean, we don't want to downplay this at all. Like, there are times in sessions where it feels like the end of the world for someone. It feels like this is so big, it's going to swallow me. I'm going to die. So, this is this is big stuff for people. Yeah.
It's repressed because somehow the system, the body mind of the child was too much to process it. So it kind of disassociated or forgot it. So these are like the most painful, shocking, disturbing information. So that's the most unpleasant content one can have, basically. So they are forgotten and repressed for a reason,
Right. To protect ourselves, yes. So hopefully we can get into more experiential on the next. We're going to have a second part of that.
Let's do a second part on it later. And so once again, this is more like the context a little bit. And even the next part, when I go experiential, don't do this at home. Work with somebody skilled who not only speaks wisdom, but is that. Rumi said this, hang out with those who not only speak wisdom, but are that, you know.
Nice.
Not only speak about trauma, but they've cleared their own trauma. Yeah. Comfortable
True.
with the demons, their seeming demons kind of devouring you.
Yeah. No, it's helpful. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Mihai. Appreciate it.